So for these reasons of the integrative effects of the altered states of consciousness and the healing effects, we have a basis from which shamanism played a central role in the evolution of more complex human behaviors and ability, particularly the ability to use ritual in a way to modulate the well-being of the group. But I think shamanism did more than that in human evolution, and I think it played a central role as a progenitor of modern culture. That is to say, shamanism contributed directly to the evolution of our cultural capacity that emerged probably somewhere on the range of 70 to 100,000 years ago. Why do I think that? Well, first, because there was shamanism present as the most significant institution in society, and the prior presence of group rituals among the apes that involved the alpha male and vocalizing and integrating the group says that this same kind of activity continued. It was the most significant feature of our early hominid life. We've seen various integrative functions of ritual that would have enhanced the ability of human groups to live together and work together. And finally, now what I want to present in this last part of the talk is how cognitive evolution was produced by shamanism. So the problem of human evolution and its cognitive abilities is that there seems to be an evolutionary dynamic that involved a variety of different innate capacities that were highly specialized. We just didn't get bigger and bigger and bigger brain. We did. And it wasn't just a generalized capacity to think, but it was specialized things to infer others' thoughts, to use language, to use mimesis, a bodily based capacity for communication. And it involved things like the ability to integrate social roles of others. And it involved things like the ability to recognize animal species and infer their behaviors. So what Mithen presents in his book on the prehistory of the mind was, how did all these innate capacities get integrated to have the dynamic, fluid, functional mind characteristic of modern human beings? And his answer is that language did it. But if you look at the evidence, language is very recent, and various forms of innate capacities for representation and to read signs and symbols were there long before we had language. So what I want to propose is that these innate modules for representation were stimulated by shamanic altered states of consciousness on two different levels. On one level, the ability of the altered states to destabilize frontal control and liberate these ancient brain systems, the reptilian and paleomammalian brain. This is where the innate intelligences are coming from. This is why a variety of things emerge under psychedelic experiences. And this is an important part of how shamanic altered states stimulate our innate capacities to think about specific things. But what we see in shamanism is the integration of these capacities. It's not just that they're being stimulated, but they're being integrated together. And I think it's the altered states of consciousness and their limbic frontal synchronization and interhemispheric synchronization that's producing this kind of enhanced representation that in essence is symbols. Symbols is re-representing, to use information from one domain to integrate it in another domain. And this is what we're getting with shamanism. First, we're getting the disinhibition, the release of these 8 innate modules, that there's something there. There's animals we have to pay attention to. We know how they're going to behave. There's spirit beings out there. This is where the whole, or say social beings out there. This is where the whole spirit dynamic comes in. There's something out there, it's alive, and it looks like a human being. And we know it's got messages for us because we can infer its thoughts. And we know it wants us to do something because we can incorporate the social roles and perspectives of others. And we can express what this is long before language through the mimetic capacities of song and dance and imitation. And ultimately, we get all this information brought to us in a visual spatial representation system, the exaptation of this dream capacity. So when we look at this guy here, is this a sorcerer? Is this a shaman? Is this an animal? What? It's the representation of a human being using the pieces of animals to show a complex being that has many different capacities. So there's the deer and there's the owl, and there may be, the hands of another kind of animal in front. And so all these different beasts are being put together within the capacity of the shaman. This is a multiple representation of the capacities of the shaman, using the world of animals as a natural symbol system to illustrate the capacities. So I think that cognitive evolution occurred through the integration of these different innate modules I mentioned above. And clearly that is what others have already said about the role of analogical thought and metaphor in the evolution of the representational capacity long before we had spoken language. Through mimesis, through enactment, through imagestic metaphors, the ability to evoke images through pantomime, through show and tell kind of stuff, the ability to communicate emotions as a system of displaced reference. We can convey through the enactment, imitation of emotions, feeling of emotions, information about what happened at other times and places. And we have the contiguity metaphors, using the body as an expressive system and animals as an expressive system to illustrate something about our understandings of the intrinsic senses that we have about our own qualities that we experience in these altered states. So shamanic metaphoric thought, I think, starts with three basic kinds of metaphors, representing one thing in terms of another. That's what metaphor is. If you try to represent nature, what's out there with the properties of the mind, with our self properties, that's animism. That's the most fundamental of all religious beliefs, according to most authorities. Animism is seeing the natural world as if it had human qualities. And then we have the self, representing the self with animal properties. These are the guardian spirits. These are the power animals. These are the animals that come to give the shaman special capacities to see or to hear, or to move quickly. And we have the social other, society at large. How can we represent this notion that we are a group? Well, humans invented, probably encountered spontaneously, the notion of using animals as a way of representing their groups. This is what Levi-Strauss discussed as totemism, the use of animal species as a natural metaphor for expressing information about the nature of societies, their identities. So shamanism and the basic structures of thought map pretty well on to the innate intelligences. The animism using the mental and self modules in an unconstrained kind of way. The visions of shamanism being this presentational symbolic capacity, the dream capacity of visual spatial intelligence. The guardian spirits and protectors being these sacred others that give our self qualities derived from the innate capacity to understand the properties of animals. Totemism, as I just said. The soul journey can be seen as a kind of dismembering of the innate normal interconnections among the visual field, the sense of personhood, the physical anatomy of representation, behavioral representation. And Hunt sees this as exemplifying the idea of a shift in perspective. He says one of the things that's normal about human social development is we acquire the capacity to see things through other people's perspectives or points of view. And in the case of the shamanic out-of-body experience, we apply that to ourselves. We see ourselves as if we were from a different perspective and point of view. This, in part, developed from the disarticulation of the normal integration of the components of the self module, which I think we also see in the death and rebirth experience, where self-transformation occurs because one sense of self dies. It's killed in visionary experiences, allowing for a restructuring of identity. So the spirit world should be understood as a natural psychology. Spirits understood as neurognostic structures, representation of some of the inherent capacities of the human that has also been discussed as archetypes. In an article I wrote called Spirits as Fundamental Structures of Consciousness, I look at how the way that we understand consciousness as a set of integrated capacities for self-reference and memory and referencing others and integrating others and associating memories and adopting emotional postures. All these different components are represented in spirits who have our ancestral traits, who represent our emotions, who represent our higher selves, and all these different other capacities of the person that are represented in beliefs about spirits. So what I see in the spirit world are a bunch of innate modules being put together. That's what makes a spirit. The animism, plus the attribution of the other, plus mind reading and inferences, plus the internalization of what others expect, plus the mind reading of their intentions. This is what spirit communication is, the integration of all these autonomous modules into something has an important message for me. So this is really brief here at the end. I'm running out of time. I've articulated this in much greater detail in shamanism. And most of the ideas I've expressed here today are also available in the articles on researchgate.net, where you can look at what I've had to say about the more intricate arguments regarding our evolution through the capacities of shamanism. So also you can get them at academia, but researchgate.net has pretty much everything, including the Shaman, Priest, and Witches book. Also, if you're interested in the data that I used to develop my understanding of magical religious practitioners, that was published as a cross-cultural study of magical religious practitioners, the data is available at ResearchGate and on the Mendeley data repository. And let me just wrap up by saying something about this data. Specifically, after I did all the analyses that led to my dissertation and, to the Shamans, Priests, and Witches book, I got a National Science Foundation grant to do coding reliability checks on my data. And I went through first and reconceptualized the entire data set based upon what I learned by analyzing it. It became a much more complex data set. And at this point in time, I've never gotten back to analyze that data set. So there's a fresh data set for someone to use for a master thesis, or if you're ambitious, I coded a 25% sample of the standard cross-cultural sample. Do the other 75%, make it articulate with all of the standard cross-cultural data. So I hope this has given you some idea about how shamanism was part of human evolution, how it contributed to human evolution, and ultimately understanding why the shamanic potentials are still with us today. It's not just some anarchic, primitive aspect of ourself. It's an aspect of the integration of the innate aspects of ourselves, our brain, our cognitive and emotional and social capacities. And so it's still as relevant today as it was in the past. Thanks. I'll take a few questions.